Today on Bits, we're going to talk about saw blades. There are a bunch of different types of power tools out there that have different types of blades, but they all have a couple of things in common, the kerf and the tooth count, so let's talk about those. But before we get into the specifics, let's talk about stock blades. When you buy a new tool, it comes with a blade that honestly is probably not very good. The blades that ship with a brand new tool are usually made as cheaply as possible, they're not going to last real long, and they may just not be a good blade at all. So if you get a new tool and it's not performing like you expect, go ahead and swap out the blade with one of quality and make sure that the blade is the problem and not the tool. When you go to replace that blade, make sure you get the right one for the job. That has a lot to do with the material that you're working with. Are you cutting wood or plastic or metal? Do you need to make straight cuts or curved cuts? Are you cross-cutting or ripping? And you just have to make sure that you get the right size blade for the tool that you're using. If you have a circular saw or a miter saw, it could be a 7 or a 10 or a 12-inch blade. Bandsaws have lots of different lengths of blades, and it really just depends on your specific tool. Let's start with circular blades. This applies to circular saws, miter saws, and table saws. First, let's talk about the rip blade. This is for cutting along the wood grain, and it's going to have a lower tooth count, 20 to 30 teeth. These teeth are more spread out so it can remove larger chips. A crosscut blade is made to go across the grain, and it's going to have a higher tooth count, 60 to 90 teeth. This removes smaller chips. You'll end up with a much smoother cut, but you have to slow down quite a bit or you'll burn your wood. Those two blades are made for specific things, and you will find a combination blade right in the middle that's around 50 teeth. It does both jobs just fine, but not as well as either one of those specific blades. There are also specialty blades that fit in these saws. You have some with a really low tooth count, like 6 teeth, and these are for cutting things like hardy board or cement board. You have a dado stack, which is multiple blades stacked up so that you can get a thicker cut, and the thickness of this cut is called the kerf. You also have thin kerf blades. These are thinner than the typical 1/8-inch blade, and they're great for underpowered saws because it's actually cutting through less material with every turn. Most of the blades that we've talked about so far will work in a table saw. Some of them will work in a circular saw, but on a miter saw, you should never use a rip blade and you can't use a dado stack. Next, let's talk about bandsaws. A bandsaw blade is a big loop with all the teeth sticking out one side. And there's two things you really need to pay attention to when you're picking out a bandsaw blade: the number of teeth per inch and the rake angle of those teeth. Another thing to think about is the width of the blade. A really wide blade will make it rigid, and that makes it a lot easier to get a long straight cut. If you need to make curved cuts, you're going to need a thinner blade. And if you're cutting metal with a bandsaw, you want to make sure to get a high TPI or tooth per inch blade. Next up is the jigsaw. Now, the blades we've talked about so far continue to move in the same direction and cut as they move. The jigsaw is a little bit different because the blade moves up and down. You can get blades that cut on the way down or on the way up, and there's all different types of tooth patterns for a jigsaw blade. Unfortunately, there's just too many for me to go through here, so make sure that you look at all the options in the store, figure out which one is correct for the material that you're cutting and the type of saw that you have. In fact, the top of the jigsaw blades have different connection types, T or U, and that really is based on your specific saw. Luckily, you can often buy jigsaw blades in a multi-pack that give you a lot of different options for a lot of different types of materials. Similar to the jigsaw is the scroll saw. It also has a blade that goes up and down, but it's mounted on a table. This is great for cutting out really small pieces and having tight curves. To make that possible, the scroll saw has a really thin blade, which does make it kind of delicate. When you're picking out the right blade for your scroll saw, make sure you get the right type because some of them have a pin at the top. Certain scroll saws can handle that pin, certain ones can't. Also, like jigsaws, there are tons and tons of different types of blades. Just look at your options in the store and figure out which one works for your saw and for your material. All right, bottom of the line about saw blades in general. The fewer teeth you have, the rougher the cut's going to be, but the faster you can go. The more teeth you have, it's going to take smaller bites, you get a better cut, but you have to go slower. If you have a really thin blade, it's not very stable, but it's great for making curves and tight cuts. The wider the blade is, the more rigid it is, which means you'll get a straighter cut overall. There are tons of different types of saw blades out there, so there's a ton of information. If you've got some stuff that we didn't cover, please leave it down in the comments and we can all learn together. Big thanks to Mortal Kombat 11 for sponsoring this episode of Bits. We've got a whole playlist of other episodes that you may want to check out, and we'll be back really soon with a new project. See you then.